I have a collection of supercapacitors, or sometimes called ultracapacitors, sometimes called electrochemical capacitors. But you can see that unlike ordinary capacitors that have capacitance of maybe a millifarads, 10 to the minus 3 farads, these capacitors, you can see, have, this is 3,000 farads. Okay? This one here is 1,400 farads. This one is 2,000 farads. So these are a very different type of device. They look very different and they function very different than the standard capacitors that you would find in your TV, your radio, or even in the camera. Now, we test these. We would test all of these capacitors using this first tester that I mentioned, because this capacitor can easily take 400, can supply 400 volts. It can supply much more than that, but we test it at up to 400 volts. These are what's called spiral wound, in that the electrodes are wound like this, and most of the capacitors are made that way. But more recently, people are beginning to make capacitors where instead of winding, they're plates laid on top of one another, and you get what's called a prismatic, or a square shape. And this is made then much like that battery down that we talked about previously. So there are spiral wound batteries and flat prismatic batteries, and spiral wound capacitors and flat capacitors. This is a capacitor made by a company in Estonia. So we have these from all over the world. This is 650 farads. It's one of the older ones that we have in the lab. It's just several cells. This is one cell, that's one cell, that's one cell. So each cell has two electrodes here. The capacitors operate very much better at low temperatures than a battery would at the same temperature. So one of the applications of those capacitors is to combine the capacitor with the lead-acid battery for starting large diesel trucks. So that gets around the problem of starting the diesel trucks, because you know they keep the diesel trucks idling all night long in the cold weather. Well, if you put the capacitors in parallel with the batteries, then that allows you to start the truck essentially using the capacitor instead of the battery. So that's one of the applications that has turned out to be a very good application for capacitors, and people are actually selling now units that in the same box includes both the battery and the capacitor. The capacitors, the electrolyte in the capacitor is much less sensitive to temperature than the electrolyte in the batteries. So it works out that the capacitance changes almost none, zero, between say minus 30 and plus 30 degrees C. But the resistance might only change by 10 or 15% when you go from room temperature to minus 30. So that's why it's a good match.